You've arrived at CozySideAudio, where dreams begin with a story. Tonight's tale is here to help you wind down and find peace. If this brings you comfort, please like, share, and subscribe so more dreamers can join us. Let the night carry you, and let's begin.
CozySideAudio presents The Cupcake Cart on Cherry Street. Chapter 1: Crumbs of Burnout. There were worse places to have a professional meltdown than the 8th floor of a glass skyscraper in downtown Chicago. But none came to mind as Lila Bennett stood in the middle of a conference room holding a birthday cake meant for a client's spoiled pug, frosting slowly melting under the lights, the word "Congrats Mr. Toots" sliding sideways. Silence fell across the sleek, modern boardroom. People in suits stared. Someone coughed. "I'm done," she said. No one responded. One woman blinked. A man reached for his iced latte. And just like that, Lila placed the cake on the table with dignified finality, turned on her heel, and walked out. Her phone buzzed the whole cab ride home: emails, texts, a Slack message from HR with 3 "Are you okay?" emojis. She ignored them all. By morning, her resignation letter was in. By afternoon, her apartment was half-packed. And by evening, she was in her rust-spotted Honda Civic with a bag of pretzels, her college hoodie, and a highly suspect audiobook titled "Finding Your Joy by Shouting at Trees." 12 hours and one dramatic gas station cry later, she was back in Willow Bay. The town hadn't changed much in the 10 years since she left. Same white clapboard shops with cheery awnings. Same narrow streets lined with flowering dogwoods. Same smell of salt and sugar from the bakery that always opened at 4 a.m. Lila parked in front of the old general store and stepped out. The breeze smelled like pie. Or possibly fried clams. Her shoulders sagged, relief and dread fighting a polite battle in her chest. Her Aunt Ginny's cottage stood at the edge of Cherry Street, as red-roofed and overstuffed as ever. Wind chimes jangled on the porch. The flower boxes overflowed with petunias that appeared to be thriving in spite of themselves. A sign hung crookedly above the door. Curiouser and Curiouser Antiques, and also tea. Lila hadn't told anyone she was coming. But when she stepped onto the porch and reached for the handle, the door opened before her fingers touched it. "Took you long enough," said Aunt Ginny, wearing an apron with a cat print and holding a wooden spoon like a wand. "I felt a shift in the universe and knew you'd finally quit that soul-sucking job." Lila blinked. "Hi, Gin." Ginny pulled her into a hug. "Welcome home, sweetheart. You look like you haven't slept in weeks. Come in, I made muffins. They're technically scones, but don't tell them." 3 cups of herbal tea and 1 accidental nap later, Lila woke up in a familiar room smelling of lavender and old books. Her childhood room, still pale blue, now doubled as Aunt Ginny's craft overflow sanctuary. Baskets of yarn were everywhere. A porcelain owl judged her from the bookshelf. Downstairs, the antique shop buzzed softly with the creak of floorboards and the low hum of a radio playing something jazzy. Lila padded down in socks and found her aunt reorganizing a shelf of teapots shaped like famous authors. She looked up and smiled. "I was wondering if you'd sneak out and drive back to Chicago in the dead of night." "I thought about it," Lila admitted. "Then you came to your senses. Good." Ginny tapped a teapot shaped like Jane Austen. "Now, tell me everything. In agonizing detail. I'll get scones." By the time the kettle boiled, Lila had confessed the entire disaster: the cake, the stress, the 80-hour weeks, the marketing campaign that involved dressing up as a banana, and the final straw, a corporate memo titled Q3 Synergy Optimization. Ginny listened with the patience of someone who once sold a haunted mirror to a woman named Carol and never apologized. "So," Ginny said finally, "what now?" "I don't know." Lila ran a hand through her hair. "I thought maybe a few days here would help me reset. Then I'll figure out my next move." Ginny smiled in a way that made Lila nervous. "Of course, darling. Stay as long as you like." The next morning, Lila wandered the town square, coffee in hand. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, quainter, quieter. People greeted her by name. Someone honked twice from a passing truck. A Labrador licked her wrist. She found herself drawn to the back alley behind Ginny's shop, where old treasures went to hibernate. And that was when she saw it. An old food cart, parked crookedly under a crooked tree. The paint was peeling. One wheel was missing a bolt. A faded decal on the side read, Miss Marigold's Cupcake Carousel. It looked abandoned, forgotten, and weirdly charming. Lila approached cautiously. The window was cracked. Inside, dusty baking tins lay haphazardly across the counter. A tiny menu board listed flavors in fading chalk: rosewater honey, lemon blueberry, cardamom chai. Without thinking, Lila reached for the door. It stuck, then creaked open with a mournful sigh. The air smelled like sugar and rust and maybe hope. "Ah," said a voice behind her. "You found her." Lila turned. Ginny stood holding a mug of tea and a tin of shortbread. "Miss Marigold," she explained. "Retired a few years ago. The cart's been sitting there since. She keeps meaning to sell it, but I think she secretly hopes someone will fall in love with it first." Lila glanced at the chipped counter. The sunlight hitting the glass window. The cupcake stencil still etched into the side. "That someone being me?" she asked. Ginny shrugged. "Stranger things have happened." By the end of the week, Lila had done the one thing no burnout recovery guide had ever recommended. She bought a cupcake cart. It cost her $800 and a promise to clear the alley by Monday. She handed over the money in a daze, then stared at her new business like it might start baking on its own. There was just one problem. Lila didn't bake. At all. Not cakes, not cookies, not boxed brownies. The last time she'd attempted banana bread, it had turned out like a brick and caused a minor relationship rift in college. But still, there was something about the cart. Something sweet and ridiculous and impossible. And for the first time in a long time, Lila felt a tiny flutter in her chest. Excitement. Or indigestion. Possibly both. She spent the next 3 days cleaning it out, scrubbing rust from the hinges and wiping 10 years of flour dust off the counter. She Googled how to run a food truck and how many cupcakes can one woman make before crying. The answer to both was unclear. Then came the question of recipes. Lila had none. Her oven hadn't been used since 2018. Which was how she found herself at the Willow Bay weekend market, holding a notepad and looking for help. That's when she saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, standing behind a table piled with hand-labeled spice jars. His hair was messy in the deliberate way of someone who didn't care or used to care too much. His expression was pure no-nonsense grump. His apron said Carlisle Spice CO in block letters. And he was currently glaring at a cinnamon stick like it had offended him personally. Lila approached cautiously. "Hi. I have a question." He looked up. Green eyes. Stubble. A faint scowl. "Do you do baking spices?" He raised one brow. "What kind of baking?" "The kind involving cupcakes." Silence. Then, "You don't look like a baker." "I'm not. But I'm trying." He gave her a slow, assessing look. "Why?" Lila hesitated. Then, "Because it was the truth," she said. "Because I bought a cupcake cart I don't know how to use and I'm having an early life crisis." The man stared at her. Then, just the barest flicker, a smile. "Come back Tuesday," he said. Before the lunch rush. Back at the cottage, Ginny stirred soup and hummed a waltz. Lila leaned against the counter, clutching a spice jar labeled Gratitude Blend and wondering what she'd just gotten herself into. Whatever it was, it smelled faintly like cardamom and second chances. And it was only just beginning. Chapter 2, The Rusty Relic. The cupcake cart had a name, as it turned out. Not just Miss Marigold's Cupcake Carousel, which was painted in faded calligraphy on one side, but something more intimate, at least, according to Miss Marigold herself, whom Lila met on a Wednesday morning over lukewarm tea and a suspiciously pink scone. "She's called Dottie," the woman declared, eyes misty behind rhinestone-framed glasses. "Short for Dorothy." Named her after my childhood neighbor. Sturdy legs, surprisingly mobile, and always full of sugar. Lila wasn't sure whether Miss Marigold meant the cart or the neighbor. But either way, Dottie had charm in spades. She was also, if Lila was honest, a complete disaster. One of the wheels was welded on at an odd angle. The sink coughed ominously when turned on. The front window stuck halfway open, like a perpetually raised eyebrow. But despite it all, there was something about the old cart that made Lila feel like she'd rescued a stray puppy or perhaps adopted a cranky old cat. The first few days were spent in a whirlwind of elbow grease and YouTube tutorials. Lila scrubbed every inch of Dottie's surfaces, peeled off what remained of the ancient vinyl decals, and replaced the rusted-out shelf brackets with new ones from the hardware store. She found an old wooden crate filled with cupcake flags shaped like unicorns and pastel dragons, which she cleaned and set aside, unsure whether they were adorable or mildly terrifying. Aunt Ginny stopped by twice daily with snacks, encouragement, and unsolicited advice. "You need a theme," she said one afternoon, sipping chamomile from a thermos. "Something that makes you stand out. What about celestial cupcakes? With edible glitter and little moons?" "I haven't figured out how to make frosting that doesn't collapse yet," Lila replied, wiping her forehead with the sleeve of her hoodie. "Let's maybe circle back to the cosmos." That night, Lila lay awake in her childhood bed with cupcake recipes open on her laptop and her fingers stained with permanent marker. She'd redrawn the chalkboard menu with new names. Lemon Daydream, Honey Lavender, Cherry Cardamom. They sounded like scents at a boutique candle store. She had no idea how to make any of them. And so, on Tuesday, just as the morning fog began to lift off the harbor, Lila marched into the Willow Bay Market with a notebook in hand and a hopeful heart. Carlisle Spice Company occupied a modest corner stall under a green and white striped awning. It was tidy. Everything about it was tidy, from the alphabetized jars to the hand-inked signs denoting things like smoked paprika, sweet, and Vietnamese cinnamon, bold and bright. Even the wooden crates were stained and sealed, giving the entire setup the air of a well-curated apothecary. Evan Carlisle stood behind it like a man only mildly at war with the world. He was wearing the same dark apron, a plain Henley, and an expression that suggested he'd already been disappointed by at least 3 people before breakfast. Lila gave him a small wave. "Hi. I brought coffee." He glanced at the 2 cups in her hand. "Is one of them black?" "Of course." "Then I'll allow it." They sat on mismatched crates behind the stall, facing the bay, gulls wheeling above. Lila handed him the coffee and pulled out her notebook. She felt like she should clear her throat or begin with an opening statement. "I don't know how to bake," she said instead. "I gathered," Evan replied, sipping. "But you own a cupcake cart." "Yes. I do. Because I'm impulsive. And slightly unhinged." To her surprise, he laughed. A low, dry chuckle, like someone remembering a joke they weren't supposed to enjoy. "I want to learn," Lila said. "Really learn. Not just follow Pinterest recipes. I want to understand the basics. How things work. Why they work." Evan studied her. The corners of his eyes crinkled faintly. "You don't need a pastry chef for that," he said. "You need patience. And discipline. I have, about 40% of both." He considered. "That'll do." And just like that, a deal was struck. The first lesson began the next morning in the back kitchen of Ginny's antique shop, which, much to Lila's amazement, contained a surprisingly modern oven, an assortment of mixing bowls, and an entire drawer dedicated to decorative sugar. "It's where I make my fig scones," Ginny had explained. "And the occasional candle. But only on weekends." Evan arrived 5 minutes early, carrying a small leather-bound notebook and a faintly judgmental air. He looked around the kitchen, nodded once, and rolled up his sleeves. "Lesson 1, he said, "is understanding your ingredients. Baking isn't like cooking. You don't throw things in and hope. You measure. You observe. You listen." Lila tried to look like someone capable of doing all 3 at once. He laid out the essentials: flour, butter, sugar, eggs, baking powder. Then he handed her a scale. Measure 150 grams of flour. She did. Carefully. Good. Now sift it. She tried. The sifter exploded flour across the counter and onto her jeans. Close enough. They moved through the basics: how creaming butter and sugar adds air, why overmixing ruins texture, the sacred ritual of scraping the sides of the bowl. Evan didn't smile much, but he was patient. Direct. He answered her questions and corrected her technique with quiet precision. By the end of the lesson, they had one small tray of vanilla cupcakes, sunken slightly in the middle, unevenly browned, but undeniably cupcakes. Lila stared at them in awe. I made these. Evan crossed his arms. Technically, we made them. I'll allow it. She offered him one. He hesitated, then took it. Don't expect praise, he warned. I don't sugarcoat. It's a cupcake, she said. It's literally sugar-coated. A pause. Then, barely, he smiled. The routine began to settle. Mornings were for lessons. Afternoons for cleaning the cart, updating the menu board, trying and failing to understand the difference between Italian and Swiss meringue. Willow Bay took notice. By the third week, passers-by were asking when Dottie would open again. Children pressed their noses to the window. An elderly man left a hand-drawn picture of a cupcake taped to the cart's handle. Lila started small. Free samples, mostly. Lavender shortbread. Mini lemon cakes with piped roses that looked more like amorphous blobs. She burned a batch of carrot muffins so badly the fire alarm shrieked for 15 full minutes. But still, people smiled. They came back. Even Evan, who remained professionally gruff, occasionally nodded in approval. Once, after a particularly fluffy batch of chocolate cupcakes, he actually said, "Not bad." Lila nearly wept. One evening, she stayed late to test a new flavor, ginger pear with honey buttercream. The kitchen was warm, the smell rich and nostalgic. Ginny sat in the corner, knitting what appeared to be a tea cozy shaped like a badger. "You look happier," she said. "I think I am," Lila admitted. "It's weird. I haven't even made money yet. I still don't really know what I'm doing. But every time I get the frosting right, or someone smiles after a bite, it feels good. Like finding your way back to yourself." Lila nodded. "Exactly." Ginny patted her hand. "Then you're doing it right." The next morning, a sign appeared in the market square. Willow Bay Summer Bako FF, entries now open. Lila read it twice, heart-pounding. Across the square, Evan was unpacking a crate of dried rose petals. She marched up to him. "I want to enter." He didn't look up. "You're not ready." "I'll never be ready. But I want to try." He sighed. "It's a month away." "That's enough time. For a miracle." "I have a mixer and unreasonable optimism." Evan finally looked at her. Something flickered in his eyes, concern, maybe, or amusement. "You'll need more than that." "Then teach me." He hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right. But no unicorn flags." Lila grinned. "Deal." That night, as she cleaned the counters and stared at her menu board, she felt something stir inside her chest. Not nerves. Not fear. Anticipation. The rusty relic on wheels had found its heartbeat again. And so had she. Chapter 3, The Grump Next Door. Evan Carlyle wasn't the kind of man you could describe with polite small-town words. If Lila had to give him a weather pattern, he was something between a fog bank and a slow-moving thundercloud. Not explosive, exactly, but perpetually heavy in the air, as though at any moment he might rain all over your parade and then begrudgingly offer you an umbrella. He wasn't rude. Just economical. With words. With praise. With emotion. Which made it all the more curious when he started showing up early to their baking lessons. Just checking the oven's calibrated, he'd mutter, even though she'd already turned it on. Or, needed to bring fresh nutmeg, as he placed it unnecessarily close to her elbow, brushing it ever so slightly in the process. Lila didn't point it out. She was too busy pretending not to notice how often she found herself glancing at his hands, strong, deft, capable, or wondering what his laugh might sound like when it wasn't buried under sarcasm. The truth was, their rhythm in the kitchen was beginning to feel like something. Not quite friendship. Not yet anything more. But a steady, careful duet. Today's lesson was sponge structure. Evan had declared, in a voice of gravitas usually reserved for battlefields and soap operas, that the soul of any cupcake is its crumb. I thought it was the frosting, Lila said, measuring flour. That's the dress. The sponge is the heart. Dramatic. You hired a former pastry chef, not a stoic monk. The oven ticked in the background. Sunlight poured through the cottage's kitchen window, catching in the flour dust air like fairy sparkles. Lila mixed carefully, trying not to overwork the batter. Evan leaned over her shoulder to check. Too thick, he murmured. She flinched. Your voice is very close. He didn't move away. Add a tablespoon of milk. She did, pulse hammering for reasons that had nothing to do with baking. The batter loosened beautifully. He nodded. Better. Lila stirred in silence for a moment. Why do you know all this? Evan moved to the counter. Because I used to make mistakes. Hundreds of them. You said you ran a restaurant. I ran a bakery, he said, cracking eggs with surgical precision. In Boston. Before, things changed. That was new. Lila paused, surprised he'd offered the information so freely. What happened? He didn't look at her. A fire. Technically arson. But no one could prove it. Oh. He shrugged, but his shoulders tensed. Insurance never paid out. Business closed. Name ruined. I left. I'm sorry. He set the bowl down. Don't be. That was 3 years ago. Willow Bay is quieter. Simpler. Do you like simple? He hesitated. Then, softer, I do now. They didn't speak for a while. The cupcakes rose in the oven, golden and proud. Lila watched Evan wash dishes with the kind of methodical intensity that made her wonder how long it had been since someone held his hand without a reason. That weekend, she officially reopened the cart. She had 6 varieties, none fancy, but all made from scratch with locally sourced ingredients. Vanilla bean. Chocolate fudge. Raspberry swirl. A very questionable attempt at pistachio rose that she renamed Spring Meadow to distract from its odd texture. She'd painted the front of the cart pale robin's egg blue. The new chalkboard menu read. Dottie's cupcakes, made with love and probably a little panic. Aunt Ginny made bunting out of vintage linens and draped them across the top window. Lila set out gingham napkins, tiny sample spoons, and a tip jar that read, Feed the Frosting Fund. The first few customers were polite and tentative, curious locals and tourists lured by pastel colors and the smell of vanilla. But word spread quickly. By noon, she'd sold out of everything but Spring Meadow, which a 9-year-old boy said tasted like soap, but in a fancy way. Even Evan stopped by. He stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, watching. When Lila finally looked up, flour-smeared and breathless, he raised an eyebrow. You didn't burn anything. Not yet. He handed her a thermos. Coffee. You looked like you needed it. She took it gratefully. Their fingers touched. Thanks. Don't thank me. I'm invested now. If this cart fails, I'll have to deal with your existential spiral. She smiled. You like the cart. I like the baking. The cart is a rust bucket with dreams of grandeur. Lila leaned against the counter. It reminds me of me. Evan glanced at her, eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. Then it's in good hands. Later that week, she found him sitting outside his spice stall, going through a ledger. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms dusted with cinnamon and old scars. The town square buzzed with chatter. Seagulls called overhead. Lila sat beside him without asking. I'm stuck, she said. Creative block. Flavor block. I want to make something unique for the bake-off. Something that tastes like summer and home and second chances. But everything feels done. Evan tapped the edge of his notebook. What are your anchors? Anchors. He leaned forward. Baking isn't about ingredients. It's about memories. Emotion. You want people to feel something when they take that first bite. I want them to feel safe, warm, like they're 8 years old and someone just handed them cake after a long day. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, turned, and pulled a small glass jar from his shelf. Inside were dried blossoms, pale pink and delicate. Cherry blossoms, he said. Not strong in flavor, but nostalgic. Evocative. Blend them with honey and cardamom, and you get something soft. Unexpected. Lila took the jar. It smelled faintly of tea and sunlight. Will you help me make it? Evan looked at her. Of course. The days blurred into a routine of batter and spice, early mornings, and late-night frosting experiments. They tested butter ratios, experimented with floral notes, debated the philosophical differences between ganache and glaze. Once, Evan accidentally flicked powdered sugar into her hair and laughed a real laugh, bright and unguarded. She almost dropped the piping bag. Another time, she caught him humming while kneading dough. It stopped the moment he noticed her. They never spoke of anything deeper. Not directly. But in the silence between tasks, Lila learned things. That Evan loved jazz piano, that he never made the same recipe twice, that he still wrote new ones in a tiny black notebook but hadn't baked them for anyone since Boston. One evening, after perfecting the cherry cardamom sponge, they sat on the cottage porch drinking iced tea. I think I'm falling for Dottie, Lila said. She's manipulative, Evan replied. And squeaks in 3 different places. She's got character. You have terrible taste in carts. They fell into a comfortable silence. Then Lila said, Are you ever going back? Evan stared out at the ocean. I don't know. Sometimes I think I could open another shop. Small. Just mine. But, the idea of failing again, of being betrayed again, it makes my hands shake. Lila set her cup down. I get that. He turned toward her. You. I left Chicago because I couldn't remember who I was anymore. I spent 10 years being efficient, polished, impressive. And then I blinked and realized I hated everything about my life. Except birthday cakes for dogs. She laughed. That was the breaking point. He smiled. You're brave. So are you. They looked at each other. For a moment, the air between them thickened warm, electric. Then he stood. Back to work. She nodded, heart pounding. On the day of the town's harvest festival, Dottie made her official market debut. Aunt Ginny wore a dress made entirely of lemon print fabric and directed foot traffic like a traffic cop. Evan delivered 2 fresh jars of cinnamon with a note that said simply, Trust your instincts. The cherry blossom cupcakes sold out in 2 hours. Lila stood at the counter, cheeks flushed, hair full of confetti, and realized something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not the kind you post about online. Not something curated or calculated. The real kind, the quiet, deep knowledge that you've made something good with your own 2 hands, and people see it. And right there, in the middle of the crowd, she saw Evan. Not smiling. But watching. Always watching. That night, she walked to his stall after the market closed. He was packing up, head down, sleeves rolled. She held out the last cupcake saved for him. He took it, looked at her, and said, Perfect crumb. And somehow, it meant more than any compliment she'd ever been given. Chapter 4. Cupcake Catastrophes. There are failures that feel gentle, like a softly closing door. And then there are the kinds that happen in front of half the town, with buttercream on your shirt and your dignity sliding down the sidewalk in a puddle of melted frosting. Lila Bennett had officially experienced both. It started with a booking, a real, paying booking. A local yoga studio, Willow Flow, was hosting a summer solstice picnic at the Bluff, complete with acoustic guitar music, herbal spritzers, and intuitive posing circles, whatever those were. They wanted 24 custom cupcakes. Something light. Something citrusy. Something Instagrammable. Lila said yes, of course. And then, for reasons she'd never be able to explain, she said she could deliver 48. 48, Evan said later, one brow raised as he leaned against the prep table. You've never done more than 24. I know. And you agreed. Why? I don't know. Enthusiasm? Ambition? Sunstroke? He sighed and pulled his apron tighter. Then I guess we better start prepping. The first batch of lemon meringue cupcakes came out tasting like regret. The second had promise, pillowy sponge, tangy curd, a high, glossy swirl of meringue until the torch malfunctioned and the tops went from golden to emergency evacuation drill. By the third batch, Lila had gone slightly feral. She'd tied her hair up with a dish towel, there were lemon peels on the floor, and she was muttering something about citrus gods conspiring against her. You're overmixing, Evan said, gently taking the bowl from her. The batter doesn't need aggression. It's not a corporate memo. I'm fine, she lied, brushing flour off her cheek and leaving behind a streak of curd. He reached over, used his thumb to wipe it away. The touch was light. Brief. Her pulse was not. They didn't speak of it. Instead, they worked in silence, him calm and methodical, her clumsy but determined. By sunset, the kitchen smelled like success and slightly singed sugar. Lila stared at the finished cupcakes lined up like little golden suns. They're beautiful. They'll travel well, Evan said, sliding them into boxes. And the curd won't slide, thanks to the stabilizer. She blinked. You used a stabilizer? He gave her a look. I'm not an animal. The day of the picnic arrived hot and bright. Lila loaded the cart with careful optimism and wore her cherry-print sundress, which made her feel like a vintage postcard. Dottie gleamed, glinted after a new coat of wax, and Ginny had added a sprig of lavender to the front for flair. Everything went well. Until it didn't. Just as Lila reached the bluff, a rogue summer gust swept across the field, flipping the cart's awning up like a parachute and sending a box of cupcakes tumbling into the grass. There was a brief, collective gasp. Someone screamed. A child laughed. Lila froze. Evan, standing nearby with a mason jar of tea, walked over. He looked down at the frosting-covered ruins. Then at her. You okay? I think so. They only lost about a dozen. But that's 12 yoga influencers without cupcakes. He picked one up, inspected the damage. It's not the end of the world. It's a disaster. It's meringue on a hill. She stared at the mess lemon sponge now dotted with clover and a small beetle and let out a hysterical little laugh. Evan tilted his head. You're going to cry or combust. Which one? Unsure. Possibly both. He gently placed a hand on her elbow. Come here. And just like that, he guided her behind the cart, shielding her from view as she took a shaky breath. Failure isn't a fire, he said quietly. It doesn't have to burn everything down. She looked up at him. You're being nice. He smirked. Don't get used to it. That evening, after salvaging what cupcakes remained and offering extras for free, Lila sat on the steps of Ginny's porch with a spoon and a tub of leftover lemon curd. Eat your feelings, darling, Ginny advised, handing her a cup of wine. Preferably with citrus and dairy. Lila took a long sip. I can't believe I ruined it. You didn't. A breeze did. And perhaps a structural oversight. The box flipped. Like, physically flipped. You're still standing, aren't you? Barely. Ginny patted her hand. You're learning. That's the part everyone forgets to romanticize. The messy, clumsy middle. Lila glanced toward the street. Evan was locking up his stall, shadow long in the amber light. He looked over once, then away. Ginny followed her gaze. You like him, she said gently. I think I do. And you're scared. Terrified. Good. Means your heart's working again. The next morning, Evan arrived with a muffin. He placed it on her counter, said nothing, and turned to go. Wait, Lila called. Did you make this? No, he said. It's from the diner. It's dry. But I didn't want to show up empty-handed. She laughed. That might be the most emotionally complex muffin I've ever received. He paused. You didn't fail yesterday. You don't have to say that. I know. That's why it matters. She looked at him, heart aching in the way it did when someone saw past your performance. I'm entering the bake-off anyway. He nodded, unsurprised. Good. I want to try the cherry cardamom cupcakes. You'll need to level up your piping skills. I've been practicing with mashed potatoes. A corner of his mouth twitched. Show me. They worked through the week like two people preparing for war, if war smelled like vanilla bean and required precision piping. Evan drilled her on structure, timing, ingredient ratios. He insisted on repetition. Perfection. Again, he'd say, every time a swirl drooped or a sponge fell flat. Again. But there were moments in between. Soft pauses. Shared smiles. A brush of fingers as they reached for the same bowl. Lila found herself looking for excuses to extend the lessons, to ask questions she already knew the answers to, just to hear him explain. One afternoon, mid-batter, she asked, "Do you ever miss Boston?" Evan didn't look up. Sometimes. Not the city. The sense of motion. Ambition. You don't have that here. He glanced at her. It's returning. The silence that followed felt like a secret neither of them had words for yet. Saturday arrived like a challenge. Willow Bay's annual bake-off was the event of the season, held under a giant tent in the town square. There were ribbons and bunting and at least 6 judges who took their duties very seriously. Lila stood behind Dottie in her new baking dress, navy, with pockets, and tried not to pass out from nerves. You'll do fine, Evan said, appearing beside her with a thermos. How do you know? Because you've worked hard. And because you didn't run away. That's your metric for success. No. That's my metric for courage. She smiled. Are you going to stay? I'll be in the back. Watching. Always. His eyes held hers. Always. The cupcakes turned out perfectly. Fluffy, fragrant, topped with a cherry blossom glaze and a whisper of cardamom cream. They were beautiful. Elegant. Hers. When the judges came by, she offered them with trembling hands. They asked questions. Nodded thoughtfully. One took a second bite. She didn't win. But she came in second. And when her name was called, the applause felt like the warmest oven she'd ever stood near. That night, she found Evan at the beach, sitting on a driftwood log. Congratulations, he said. Thank you. I still can't feel my toes. You should be proud. I am. She sat beside him, toes in the sand. I was scared, she admitted. That I'd fail again. That I'd look ridiculous. You didn't. I still don't know where this is going. The cart. My life. That's okay. I used to have everything mapped out. Deadlines. Milestones. Timelines. And now. She looked at the ocean. Now I have batter under my nails and a strange fondness for antique ovens. Evan chuckled. You're becoming one of us. She glanced at him. Do you ever think about starting again? He was quiet. Yes, he said at last. More lately. With someone? He turned to her. His expression unreadable. Maybe. They sat in silence, the tide rising slowly around them. Later, back at the cottage, Lila lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her fingers smelled like vanilla. Her heart felt like it had turned a corner. And downstairs, Dottie sat parked under the stars, quiet but full of promise. Chapter 5, Buttercream and Secrets. Willow Bay's summer mornings had a softness to them, like the town was still rubbing its eyes and stretching toward the sun. The air smelled faintly of salt and honeysuckle, and the seagulls sounded more like gossiping neighbors than birds. Lila found herself waking earlier each day not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She padded barefoot into the kitchen, still in pajamas, and opened the curtains to let in the light. The cottage's little window herb garden was bursting. Basil, mint, and thyme poked toward the sun like eager students raising their hands. She made a mental note to clip some for the afternoon batch of honeytime cupcakes. She never used to think in cupcake flavors. Now she caught herself dreaming in ganache and glaze. By mid-morning, Dottie was parked on Cherry Street in her usual spot across from the hardware store, with a modest but devoted stream of regulars stopping by. Ginny sat perched on a fold-out chair beside the cart, crocheting what appeared to be an ambitious shawl in neon pink. "Morning, darling," Ginny said, adjusting her sunglasses. "The peach crumble ones today?" "Just pulled from the oven," Lila said. "With a brown butter glaze." "Your waistline is going to be the ruin of me," she declared fondly, fishing a few bills from her woven clutch. "And you've got a visitor." Lila followed her gaze, and her heart immediately tried to climb out of her chest. Evan. He wore a white t-shirt with flour smudged on the shoulder, and his hair looked just rumpled enough to imply he'd come straight from the kitchen. He held out a brown paper bag. "Leftover croissants. I overbaked for the brunch crowd." She took the bag, ignoring the butterflies in her throat. "You're beginning to look suspiciously generous." "I like keeping your standards high." "Right. By plying me with pastry." He shrugged. "It's an effective tactic." He started to leave, but hesitated. "You free tonight?" Her pulse stuttered. "Depends. Is this a cupcake emergency or—" "Not work. Just dinner." A pause. "I'd like that," she said. The restaurant Evan picked was tucked at the edge of town, a quiet place with string lights and creaky floors. The tables were mismatched wood, the menus handwritten in pencil. "This used to be my favorite spot," he said as they sat a day. "Before I left for Boston." "What changed?" "Everything." They ordered pasta and local white wine, and for a while, they talked easily about childhood summers, about Ginny's overly aggressive bridge group, about the strange hierarchy of local ducks. But eventually, the conversation drifted toward the thing Lila had been too hesitant to ask about until now. "Why did you come back?" she asked. Evan took a slow sip of wine. "I burned out." She blinked. "You?" "I know. Shocking. The grumpy one has feelings." "I didn't mean." "I know. But yes. I burned out. I was running kitchens, chasing stars, dealing with critics who cared more about foam than food. I got tired of yelling. Tired of watching chefs half my age crack under pressure. And so, you just left." "My mom called and said the lake smelled like lilacs that week. I booked a ticket the next day." Lila looked at him, really looked. "You're not what I expected," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Gruff ex-chef with mysterious past doesn't fit the marketing mold?" "Something like that." There was a beat of silence. "What about you?" he asked. "You left a whole other life behind." "I think it left me," she said quietly. "I thought I had to chase that version of myself. The perfect one. But every time I reached a milestone, it felt hollow. Like I'd tricked everyone. Including me." He studied her, his gaze steady. "Do you feel that way here?" She smiled. "Less." After dinner, they walked along the shoreline, shoes in hand. "You know," Lila said, "I always thought small towns were for other people. And now, they feel like a secret I didn't know I was allowed to have." They stood there a moment, moonlight on the water, sea breeze tousling their hair. Lila turned toward him. And then, without fanfare or ceremony, he leaned in. The kiss was gentle. Grounded. Like they'd both been slowly building toward this moment, layer by layer, frosting by frosting. When they pulled apart, neither of them spoke right away. Finally, Evan said, "That wasn't a tactic." "Good," she said. "Because it worked." The next few days passed like a hazy, sugar-dusted dream. Evan didn't suddenly become romantic. He was still grumpy, still opinionated, still muttering things like your buttercream's too soft with furrowed brows. But now there was something else beneath it. An undercurrent of warmth. He brought her coffee before sunrise. He fixed the squeaky cart wheel without being asked. He tucked a small bag of espresso nibs into her apron one afternoon and said, "They'll punch up your mocha cupcakes." She kissed him behind the cart that day, and Ginny pretended not to notice. But Willow Bay was small. And small towns, especially ones with a fondness for knitting clubs and community theatre, had a particular relationship with gossip. It started with Mrs. Hendricks at the library, who saw Lila and Evan walking too closely near the pier. It spread through the florist, the fishmonger, and eventually arrived in full force at the Wednesday morning book club, where speculation reached a fever pitch. "Did you hear?" Ginny told Lila with an amused smile, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Apparently you and Evan are secretly engaged." Lila nearly dropped her icing spatula. "Engaged? And opening a bakery together in France. What?" "Oh yes. And there's talk of a dog named Buttercup." Lila gaped. "I've kissed the man twice." "Darling," Ginny said, sipping her tea. "This is Willow Bay. 2 kisses and a croissant exchange is practically a proposal." That evening, as Lila wiped down the prep counter, Evan leaned against the doorway with a crooked grin. "So, France?" She rolled her eyes. "You heard. I was approached by Mrs. Mulrooney at the hardware store. She wanted to know if we'd considered eloping to Paris in the fall." "I don't even own luggage." He stepped closer. "Do you want to run away?" "Not even a little." "Good," he said. "Because I kind of like it here." Lila looked at him. "Even with the rumors?" "Especially with the rumors." He kissed her again then, slow and steady, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like her life wasn't spinning out of control but landing in a place it had always meant to find. But as sweet as the season had become, real life hadn't stopped moving. One morning, Lila found an envelope tucked under the cart's register. It was from her old boss. She opened it slowly. Inside was a note. "Heard you're baking now. Glad you're alive. If you ever want to come back, there's a spot waiting." And just like that, the air around her changed. Not because she wanted to go back, but because the choice had returned. That night, she sat on the porch steps with Ginny, the envelope beside her. "I didn't think I'd hear from them," she said. Ginny sipped her wine. "And now that you have, I feel torn. Do you miss it?" "Not really. But it's safe. Familiar." Ginny looked at her kindly. "Darling, you don't owe safety your whole life." Lila leaned her head on Ginny's shoulder. "What if I mess this up?" "You will mess things up. That's part of it. And Evan isn't porcelain. He can take it." Lila smiled faintly. "Sometimes I forget I'm allowed to be happy." Ginny squeezed her hand. "Then we'll remind you. 1 cupcake at a time." The following day, Evan showed up before dawn, holding 2 coffees and a bag of plums. "New flavor idea," he said. "For the cart?" "For your future. Whether it stays here or goes wherever you go next." She looked at him. "I don't want to go." "Then stay." "It's not that simple." "It is. You just have to choose what feeds you." She blinked. "Emotionally?" He smirked. "And literally. Now let's make plum spice cake." As the cart rolled out that morning, smelling of cinnamon and stone fruit, Lila tucked the letter away in a drawer. Not gone. Not forgotten. Just waiting. Because sometimes, you had to put your future on pause to live your present. And right now, the present was messy and sunlit and brimming with buttercream. And she was exactly where she needed to be. Chapter 6, A Recipe for Bravery. The summer market was in full swing by the time Lila arrived, Dottie clunking dutifully over the cobblestone lot like a slightly asthmatic elephant. Farmers were unloading crates of blueberries and tomatoes, local crafters were hanging hand-stitched bunting between their booths, and somewhere near the old bandstand, a harmonica was being played badly but with great enthusiasm. Lila wore a cherry-print sundress and a headscarf she'd borrowed from Ginny, and for the first time in weeks, her apron wasn't already dusted with flour. She'd baked all her cupcakes the night before and iced them in the early morning light, deliberately slow and careful, as if the swirls of buttercream could calm her nerves. She was debuting something new today, her first original recipe. A small batch blueberry lavender cupcake with whipped cream cheese frosting and candied lemon peel. Evan hadn't helped with it. He didn't even know about it yet. It was the first thing she'd done entirely on her own. "You look like you robbed a 1950s picnic basket," Ginny said as she swept past Lila's cart, oversized straw hat tilted rakishly to one side. "High praise," Lila said, passing her a sample of the new cupcake. Ginny took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and then her face lit up. "Oh, sweetheart. You've done it. You like it. I love it. It's like eating a garden at twilight. I think that's the nicest thing anyone's said about my food." Ginny leaned close. "You should enter the bake-off." Lila blinked. "The what?" "The Willow Bay Summer Bake-Off," Ginny said, as if it were common knowledge. "It's in 3 weeks. Huge event. Think bunting, music, absurdly competitive church ladies. First prize is a blue ribbon, bragging rights, and a feature in the town newsletter. Oh, and eternal glory." "I don't bake for glory," Lila said. "Darling, you bake because you love it. But I think it's time the town knew that, too." Lila opened her mouth to argue, but just then, a little girl tugged on her mother's hand and pointed to the cupcake display with stars in her eyes. And just like that, something inside Lila shifted. Maybe it wasn't about winning. Maybe it was about standing up and saying, "This is me." Later that day, Evan swung by, his shirt dusted with flour and a smudge of chocolate on his chin. "Busy?" he asked. "I sold out of the new flavor," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Oh. Blueberry lavender. Cream cheese frosting. Candied lemon." He raised his eyebrows. "Yours?" She nodded. He reached across the counter and tucked a stray wisp of hair behind her ear. "I'm proud of you," he said, just like that. No theatrics. No big grin. And somehow, it meant more because of that. That night, she stood in her kitchen with the old recipe notebook Ginny had given her weeks ago. She flipped to a blank page, titled it Bake-Off Ideas, and wrote the words Lemon Basil Dreams in loopy script. Beneath it, she wrote, "Not just a cupcake. A memory." And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was trying to be someone else. She just felt like herself. 3 days later, Lila and Evan met at the edge of the lake for what had become their new tradition, Tuesday twilight picnics. He brought bread and olives. She brought ginger peach scones and lemonade. They sat on a patchwork quilt beneath the willow tree, toes in the grass. "You ever get scared?" she asked suddenly. "Of what?" "Of all this. Of letting it matter." Evan tore a piece of bread and handed it to her. "I used to be scared of everything. Of failing. Of being seen. Of not being enough. And now? I'm still scared. But I don't run from it anymore." She looked at him, heart wide open. "I'm entering the bake-off." His eyes lit up. "You are. Don't act so shocked." "I'm not. Good. You should." There was a pause. "You'll help me, right?" He smiled, warm and steady. "Every step of the way." The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of flour, laughter, and mild frosting-related catastrophes. They experimented in his kitchen late into the night. Lemon curd explosions. Burnt basil. A short-lived flirtation with edible glitter that resulted in the cat sparkling for days. Every night, they tasted and adjusted. Every morning, Lila woke up with a deeper belief that she could actually do this. Ginny popped in often with commentary. "This one's too tart. This one needs crunch. This one tastes like regret." But eventually, one cupcake made her go quiet. She chewed, narrowed her eyes, and said, "That's the one." Lila had never been so proud of a dozen tiny cakes in her life. The day before the bake-off, the nerves hit like a freight train. "What if I freeze?" Lila asked, pacing her porch. "You won't." "What if they hate it?" "They won't." "What if I spill frosting on the mayor?" "Well," Evan said, "then at least the newsletter will be interesting." She swatted his arm, and he kissed her forehead. "You've done the work," he said. "You just have to show up." Lila swallowed hard. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." The morning of the bake-off dawned hot and bright, with a breeze off the lake and a sky the color of powdered sugar. The town square had been transformed into a baking carnival. Checkered tablecloths, streamers, booths lined with cakes, tarts, pies, and a truly intimidating number of meringues. Lila's booth was simple: white linen, a glass stand of lemon basil cupcakes, and a little hand-lettered sign that read, "Made with bravery and butter." People wandered past, sampling and smiling. The mayor complimented the icing. A pair of twins argued over who got the last mini cupcake. Lila stood straight, chin high, heart pounding. When the judges arrived, she handed over her cupcake with trembling hands. They tasted, murmured, made notes, then moved on. That was it. No dramatic reactions. No praise. Just a quiet nod and a tick of a pen. Lila stepped back from the booth, breath shaky. Evan appeared beside her, slipped his hand into hers. "You did it," he said. "I don't know if it's enough." "It is." The announcement came 2 hours later. The town gathered under the bunting-draped gazebo, ice cream cones and lemonade in hand. The head judge, a stern woman named Margaret with a terrifyingly precise bun, stepped to the microphone. "In third place," she said, for her triple berry crumble tart, Doris Klein. Applause. "In second place, for his caramel apple croissants, Noah Miller." More applause. "And in first place," Margaret said, glancing at her card, "for her lemon basil cupcakes, Lila Montgomery." The square went quiet for half a second and then erupted in cheers. Lila stood frozen. Ginny shoved her forward. Evan grinned like a fool. Lila climbed the steps to the gazebo in a daze. Margaret handed her the blue ribbon and a small bouquet of daisies. "Well done," she said briskly. That was a cupcake with something to say. Lila could only nod, eyes wet. That night, the town held a bonfire by the lake. There was music and dancing and more pie than any one town could reasonably consume. Evan found her near the fire, barefoot in the grass, ribbon tucked into her pocket. "You looked surprised," he said. "I still am." "Don't be." He took her hands, kissed her knuckles. "You're brave," he said. "No. I'm just brave," he repeated. "Not because you're fearless, but because you keep showing up anyway." She leaned into him. "Do you think I could really do this?" "You are doing it." She smiled against his chest. "So what now?" He brushed his lips against her temple. "Now we build." And as the fire crackled and the stars spilled across the lake, Lila thought, maybe bravery wasn't loud. Maybe it looked like showing up with cupcakes. Maybe it looked like choosing your own heart, over and over again. Maybe that was enough. And maybe, just maybe, it was everything. Chapter 7, A Dash of Doubt. Lila should have been flying. She'd won the Willow Bay Summer Bake-Off. Her lemon basil cupcakes had been photographed for the town newsletter, and the mayor's personal Instagram, apparently. Children were asking for the bravery cupcakes, and even Doris Klein, longtime ruler of all things baked and iced, had stopped by to say, "I liked the balance of citrus." But the high was wearing off. And underneath it all, a subtle dread had begun to rise. Because after the applause and the ribbon and the little parade, Ginny insisted on organizing down Cherry Street with a glittered poster board reading "Our Cupcake Queen," there was silence. No new orders. No lines at the cart. No mentions in the daily chatter of the coffee shop. And with every slow day, the doubt crept back in like fog beneath a door. You're spiraling, Ginny said over her cup of hibiscus tea. I am not spiraling, Lila said, stirring her iced coffee so vigorously the straw snapped in half. You're stress stirring. It's a symptom. Maybe people are tired of cupcakes. Ginny raised an eyebrow. People are never tired of cupcakes. They are tired of mediocrity, which you are not offering. Lila sighed and sank into the cafe bench. What if the bake-off was just a fluke? A small-town kindness? Like, oh, the poor girl who quit her high-powered job and talks to her food truck. Let's throw her a ribbon so she doesn't combust. You're ridiculous, Ginny said fondly. You won because your cupcakes are good. And also because Evan taught you how to temper eggs without crying. That earned a tiny laugh. I don't know. Lately he's been distant. Ginny leaned forward. Define distant. He hasn't come by the cart all week. He cancelled our picnic. Said he had a meeting about a kitchen expansion. That sounds normal. It does, Lila admitted. And yet. Ginny sipped her tea thoughtfully. Do you like him? I think I might be falling for him. Well, then. Of course you're spiraling. By Thursday, Lila had tried 4 new recipes in one day: blueberry cardamom, peach honeycomb, chai mocha, and something she accidentally invented by spilling lemon curd into a bowl of brown sugar. None of them tasted right. She dumped the whole lot into the compost bin behind Dottie and sat on the back step, head in her hands. A little knock startled her. She looked up to see a teenager in a Willow Bay High sweatshirt holding a notebook and looking impossibly nervous. Are you Lila? Yes. I'm doing a piece for the school paper. On local entrepreneurs. My advisor said you were, like, a perfect example. Lila blinked. Yeah, the girl said, flipping to a page in her notebook. You left a corporate job in the city to open a cupcake cart. You won the bake-off. People say you're bringing life back to the market. Lila had to swallow the lump in her throat. Sure, she said quietly. Ask away. After the interview, she walked home slowly, thinking about the girl's questions. Why cupcakes? What inspires your flavors? What do you hope people feel when they eat your food? She hadn't had polished answers. But she'd spoken from the heart. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be enough. The next morning, Lila opened the cart to find a small box tied with twine resting on the counter. Inside was a single scone, golden and fragrant, with a sticky note that read, You once said scones were your weakness. She bit into it and smiled so hard her cheeks hurt. It was perfect. But more than that, it was something else. A peace offering. A reminder. A breadcrumb back to connection. That night, Evan showed up at her door. Hair tousled. Sleeves rolled. Holding a crate of lemons and wearing that look that made her ribcage tighten. I've been a bit of a ghost, he said. You have. I got offered a partnership at the inn. Lila blinked. That's amazing. It is, he said. But it comes with conditions. Fancy kitchen. Set menu. A dress code. She waited. They want me to give up the cottage bakery. Focus entirely on the restaurant. No more odd experiments. No more helping mysterious women with cupcake carts. Lila's stomach dropped. I told them no, he said. What? I said I'm not interested unless I can keep baking on my own terms. With my hands. With real ingredients. With people who make me remember why I started in the first place. Lila swallowed. Was that me? He stepped closer. You remind me who I am when I'm not trying to impress anyone. Her heart was a thundercloud. Heavy. Bright. Evan. I like you, he said. In a slow burn, learn you inside out, bake until dawn kind of way. She laughed, breath-catching. That sounds very inconvenient. It is, he said. But worth it. And then he kissed her. Soft. Slow. Sweet as honey. And everything inside Lila unraveled and rewove itself, like sugar dissolving into warm tea. Later, lying on her couch with her head on Evan's shoulder and the scent of cinnamon on their skin, Lila whispered, "What if this all falls apart?" "It won't." "But what if it does?" "Then we pick up the pieces," he said, "and bake something new." The next week, Dottie had a line down the block. Someone had reposted the school paper article, and suddenly, bravery cupcakes were trending locally. Ginny made shirts. Evan printed a menu board for her cart. And Lila stood behind her counter, apron dusted with flour, cheeks flushed, heart full. One afternoon, a man in a navy blazer with perfect hair strolled up to the cart. "Lila Montgomery?" "Yes. I'm with Hearth and Home magazine. We're doing a feature on reinvented small-town businesses. Heard about you from a friend in publishing. She said your cupcakes made her cry." Lila stared. "We'd love to interview you. Maybe even include a recipe." She blinked. "Seriously?" "Very. Can we schedule something?" She scribbled her number on a napkin, still dazed. After he left, she turned to Evan, who had just arrived with fresh strawberries. "I think my life just changed again." He grinned. "Get used to it." That evening, as the sun dipped low over Willow Bay and the air smelled of bread and possibility, Lila sat in Dottie's front seat, sipping lavender lemonade and watching the town she thought she'd left behind bloom around her. It wasn't perfect. She still got anxious. Still questioned things. Still burned the occasional tray of scones. But she was here. She was real. And with every cupcake she sold, every person who smiled and said, "Thank you, this reminds me of my grandmother," she felt something anchor in her chest. She belonged. Not in a corporate tower. Not in a polished city office. But here. With her cart. With her town. With Evan. And even on the days when doubt whispered and fog gathered at the edges, Lila had learned this. Some recipes didn't need exact measurements. Just courage, a little butter, and someone who believed in you when you couldn't quite believe in yourself. Chapter 8: Lemon Days and Late Nights. The end of summer came gently to Willow Bay. The salt breeze softened, the sun curled lower against the hills, and the tourists trickled home like tidewater slipping back to sea. On Cherry Street, autumn arrived not with fireworks, but with the quiet thump of falling apples and the cinnamon-sweet scent of new pies in the air. Lila stood inside Dottie one Thursday morning, watching golden leaves collect on the cobblestones. She pressed her palms against the counter and inhaled deeply. The air inside the cart smelled of vanilla and lemon zest. She liked that. She wanted her life to smell like that. "Do we have enough eggs?" she called over her shoulder. Evan was on a tiny stepladder, trying to retrieve a tray of tart molds from the top cupboard. "We've got 12.5. Unless you've started keeping ghosts in the fridge again." She made a face. "That was a ghost. You just don't believe in the supernatural." "No, I just believe in the laws of dairy expiration." She turned and smirked at him, then reached for the notepad she kept tucked under the register. "Okay. We'll need more eggs. And possibly a medium haunting. Just to keep things interesting." He grinned. "Add one rainy night and 2 unresolved feelings while you're at it." They were in a good place now. Better than good, actually. There was something new about the way he looked at her these days, less guarded, more playful. More like someone who wasn't afraid of being seen. She liked that too. The cupcake cart had become a local staple. Kids on bikes would stop for free samples. Retirees sat nearby with tea in travel mugs, chatting about sugar ratios like they were politics. Lila introduced new flavors weekly: apple maple crunch, pear caramel glaze, even a brief flirtation with rosemary fig that divided the town like a referendum. Each batch was a love letter. Each tray of tiny cakes a new chance to say, "I'm here. I'm trying." But with the growth came new challenges. Demand was rising. She was up at 5 every morning and still baking past 10. Her apartment above the bookshop looked like a flower bomb had detonated. "I think I might need help," she admitted one evening, slumping onto the floor with her back against the oven. Evan tossed her a dish towel. You do. You're exhausted. She looked up at him. I keep thinking it'll settle. But it doesn't. That's what happens when people like what you do. Yeah, well, it's terrifying. He crouched beside her, tucking a curl behind her ear. You've got something real here, Lila. You don't have to carry it all alone. The next morning, Ginny arrived with a girl named Zoe, who had a tattoo of a lemon wedge on her wrist and a resume folded into the shape of a paper crane. I've worked weddings, food stalls, and for 6 months, I made lemon meringues for an underground dessert speakeasy in Portland, Zoe said, biting into a test cupcake. This is good. Lila hired her on the spot. With Zoe helping at the cart and Evan offering more kitchen time at his cottage, Lila finally found herself breathing again. She spent that weekend walking through town, noticing things she hadn't had time to notice for weeks. The way the light hit the bookstore window. The smell of popcorn drifting from the harbor cinema. She caught Evan watching her from across the market square. Not in a heated, cinematic way. Just a look. Gentle. Present. Like he saw her as something worth watching. One evening, as they cleaned up after a long day, Evan said, "You ever think about opening a storefront?" She blinked. What, like, a bakery? He shrugged. You've got the following. The press. The charm. I also have an allergy to commitment and a lease that expires in 6 months. He leaned against the counter. I know a place. Of course you do. He handed her a flyer. It was a tiny shop off Birch Lane, tucked between a wool store and a used record nook. The windows were dusty but wide. The rent was, astonishingly, reasonable. You think I could do it? She asked, after a pause. I know you could. She traced the address with her thumb. Would you help? He smiled. Only if you let me be in charge of scones. Fine. But I get cupcakes, muffins, and emotional ambience. Deal. They spent the next week sketching out ideas on napkins and backs of receipts. Zoe drew a floor plan with colored pencils. Ginny brought them a vintage cash register she swore once belonged to a 1920s chocolatier. The town buzzed with the rumor. Lila's opening a shop. Evan's going in too. Can you imagine? By Friday, she'd made a decision. She signed the lease with hands that trembled slightly. Afterward, she and Evan sat in the middle of the empty shop floor, legs stretched out, pizza box between them. Remind me to never sign anything without carbs again, she said. You're glowing, he said. I'm sweating. Still counts. She looked around at the blank walls, the dusty corners, the promise of something new. Do you think this is what it's supposed to feel like? She whispered. Evan took her hand. I think this is what it feels like when you're building a life that fits. On the first truly cold day of the season, Lila woke to a sky the color of pale cotton and the distant honk of migrating geese. She wrapped herself in a cardigan, made coffee, and stood by the window. Below, the street looked soft with morning. She was tired. But not the brittle kind of tired she used to carry in the city. This was full-body tired. Cupcake tired. Satisfied tired. She smiled. She had flour under her nails, sugar in her hair, and a boy who brought her strawberries at sunrise. And soon, she'd have a bakery with a lemon-yellow door. She'd name it something simple. Something true. Maybe just, Dottie's. After the cart that started it all. After the dream that wouldn't quit. After the part of her that finally believed she belonged. Chapter 9, Batter Up. The day of the Willow Bay Bake-Off began like any other Saturday, except the entire town was vibrating with barely contained anticipation and smelled faintly of cinnamon and competitive spirit. Lila stood in her apartment kitchen at 6:12 a.m., staring down a mixing bowl like it had insulted her mother. Right, she muttered, tying her apron. Let's not embarrass ourselves today. Downstairs, Zoe was already preheating the portable oven in the cupcake cart and triple-checking their ingredient list. Evan was due in 15 minutes with backup piping tips and his trademark quiet calm. The competition would be held in the community hall, But every storefront on Cherry Street was decked out like it was Christmas morning. Bunting fluttered in the breeze, and shop windows glittered with sugar sculptures, cookie bouquets, and hopeful signage. Good luck, Lila, Team Cupcake, whip it good. She tried to steady her nerves with a second cup of coffee. Lila, Zoe called from below. Your lemon curd is having an existential crisis. Same, Lila muttered, and ran downstairs. The community hall had been transformed. Rows of baking stations lined the center, each equipped with mini ovens, prep tables, and a cheerful sign bearing the contestant's name. Spectators filled the perimeter with folding chairs and thermoses. There were clipboard-wielding judges, a roving radio host, and a photographer from the Willow Bay Gazette. I regret everything, Lila whispered as Evan handed her a bottle of vanilla extract. You'll be brilliant, he said. She glanced at him. You're calm. He shrugged. I'm not competing. That's not comforting. He smiled. Then maybe this is. He handed her a small, folded slip of paper. She tucked it into her apron pocket without looking. For later. The theme for the bake-off was coastal comforts. Contestants had 3 hours to make a signature baked item inspired by the sea, the shore, or local traditions. Lila's entry, cherry blossom cupcakes with a whisper of cardamom, filled with a tart cherry lime jam and topped with vanilla bean buttercream. It was ambitious. Maybe foolishly so. The prep began. Flour flew. Butter hissed. People whisked like they were conducting orchestras. Lila worked methodically, her fingers remembering each step as if by instinct. She had practiced this recipe nearly a dozen times, but never under pressure, never with 100 eyes watching. Zoe hovered at the edge of the floor, sending encouraging thumbs-ups between sips of oat milk latte. Midway through hour 2, disaster struck. Her jam didn't set. She stared at the bubbling pot with horror. No, no, no. Don't you dare. Evan, from the sidelines, raised an eyebrow. How bad? She mouthed, soup. He disappeared for a moment, then reappeared with a chilled metal bowl and a small tin. Quick freeze trick, he said, handing it over. And a whisper of agar powder. Just enough to coax it. Lila worked like mad, salvaging what she could, pouring the jam into the freezer bowl, swirling, stirring, praying. With 7 minutes left, the texture set just enough. She piped the filling into the cupcakes with trembling fingers, smoothed the buttercream into pale pink swirls, and scattered a few candied petals across the tops. Time. Hands off. She stepped back. She had done it. The judging took an hour. Lila hovered near the lemonade station, her stomach too knotted to eat anything. Evan stood beside her, saying nothing, just offering quiet presence and the occasional hand squeeze. Finally, the judges returned. The crowd hushed. The runner-up, Judge Pritchard boomed, for her creative use of sea salt and marshmallow, is Miss Georgia Tate. Applause. And the bake-off winner, for outstanding flavor, originality, and presentation, Lila Bennett. For a moment, all she could do was blink. Then the crowd erupted. Zoe shrieked. Evan smiled wider than she'd ever seen. Lila felt her feet leave the floor, her cheeks split into a grin, and her heart stutter wildly in her chest. She had won. The prize was mostly symbolic, a glass trophy shaped like a mixing spoon and a $250 gift card to the town co-op, but the recognition felt enormous. More than that, the win stitched something inside her back together. That evening, after packing up, Evan and Lila walked the long way home through the quiet town. The moon was high. The air was soft. I should open the note now, she said, finally remembering. Evan nodded. Might be time. She unfolded the paper. In his tidy handwriting, you already know how to make beautiful things. Now it's just about trusting that they'll hold. She looked up. He wasn't smiling, not really. Just watching her. Like he always did. She stepped closer. You're not just talking about cupcakes, are you? He shook his head. Her hands trembled slightly. What if I drop it? What if I mess it up? He reached for her wrist and tugged her gently into his arms. Then we clean it up. And start again. She kissed him. There in the middle of Birch Lane, under fairy lights still strung from summer festivals, with powdered sugar still on her sleeve and cardamom on her breath. She kissed him like she'd known him for years, and maybe she had some part of her, some piece waiting to believe it could be safe and soft and real. And Evan kissed her back like he'd been waiting too. The next morning, the bakery-to-be smelled like fresh paint and possibility. The sign hadn't gone up yet, and the cupboards were still empty. But the space already felt like something Lila could call home. Zoe brought muffins. Evan brought coffee. Ginny brought a vintage cupcake tin that might have been cursed. They sat cross-legged on the floor, planning. Outside, the air was crisp with early fall. Inside, it was warm. So very warm. Chapter 10, Stirred, Not Shaken. The wind off the sea carried the first hints of autumn through Willow Bay, saffron-tinged leaves, cinnamon drifting from windows, a deep golden light that made everything look like it had been dipped in syrup. Lila leaned against the open window of the cupcake cart, cheeks flushed, arms dusted in flour. The bake-off win had done something to her, not just to her reputation in town, though orders were now rolling in faster than she could say Ganake, but to her own sense of steadiness. She was no longer the outsider with a novelty cart. She was part of the rhythm of Cherry Street. And slowly, steadily, her dream was rising like good dough. She scribbled a few notes in her cupcake ledger. Zoe had insisted they needed an actual business log, and then caught sight of Evan's spice stall across the square. He was setting up his autumn stock: nutmeg tins, cinnamon quills, cardamom pods in tiny glass jars, and bundles of dried orange slices tied with twine. He wore a flannel shirt today, sleeves rolled, and his hair was a touch too long. Lila smiled to herself. She didn't quite know when they'd stopped dancing around each other. Maybe it was the kiss. Or the three that came after it. Or the way he'd taken to sliding her favorite tea onto her work table each morning without comment. But something had shifted. Quietly. Fully. It wasn't fireworks. It was the slow lighting of lanterns. They worked side by side each Saturday now, the cupcake cart and the spice stall forming a warm corner of the market square. Customers came for cupcakes and stayed for spice tips, or vice versa. Zoe, ever the strategist, was developing a menu expansion. We need to ride the wave, Lila. Limited edition flavors. Seasonal themes. Maybe a cupcake of the week rotation? Lila nodded. What about a cozy autumn box? 4 flavors. 1 spicy, 1 fruity, 1 nutty, 1 surprise. Brilliant. Name it something adorable. Like, fall into frosting. Zoe groaned. Too punny. Evan, passing by with a box of cinnamon sticks, offered, the autumn sampler. Lila brightened. That's actually good. Don't sound so surprised. I'm not. I'm medium surprised. He smirked and kept walking. The cupcake cart began to hum with life. Each Friday, Lila tested new recipes: maple pecan cupcakes with browned butter frosting, apple cider cakes with cinnamon drizzle, hazelnut mocha swirls that made Zoe audibly weep. People started requesting flavors by name. Kids drew crayon pictures of the cart. One elderly man named Arthur came every Tuesday just to flirt mildly and tell Lila she reminded him of his late wife if she had been worse at frosting. She adored him. The town's affection wrapped around her like a scarf she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Even Ginny admitted, after her 3rd cupcake in 1 week, I never expected this to stick. But you, Lila Bug, seem to be baking something that matters. Lila blinked back tears. Thanks, Gin. You'll repay me in scones. Done. One chilly afternoon, Lila and Evan sat on the back steps of the spice stall, sharing a container of leftover orange zest buttercream. They each had a spoon. Do you miss it? She asked softly. What? The big kitchen. The rush. Michelin stars. He thought for a moment. I miss the hum. The feeling when it's all working and you're part of something brilliant. But not the ego wars. Not the sleeplessness. Not the way it made everything else small. She nodded. And you? He asked. Do you miss your old life? Lila scraped the side of the container. Sometimes I miss the polish. The feeling of knowing exactly what came next. But mostly I miss believing that what I was doing mattered. I spent so long performing a version of success I never wanted. He offered her a small, warm look. And now? She smiled. Now I bake feelings into cakes. It's wildly inefficient. But it feels like mine. They sat in silence a while, the sun slipping lower, the scent of spices in the air. Then Evan asked, would you ever open a storefront? Lila turned. Like, a real bakery? He nodded. Cupcake cart goes brick and mortar. Windows full of frosting and twinkle lights. Her breath caught. Do you think we're ready? I think we're getting there. They started looking. Just casually at first. A couple of empty storefronts, some old listings. But then Ginny called one morning, voice excited. That corner shop at Maple and Lark? The one with the blue shutters? It's going up for lease. Lila and Evan toured it that afternoon. It was dusty, neglected, and smelled vaguely of mildew. But the bones were beautiful. High ceilings, 2 front windows, and a nook that could house the cupcake display perfectly. Evan ran his hand along the counter. We could make this work. Lila felt her heart race. It's terrifying. It is. She looked at him. But it's also exciting. He smiled. Like most good things. They signed the lease the following Tuesday. Word spread fast. Lila's opening a bakery became the whisper on every corner. Zoe designed a logo. Ginny recruited volunteers for painting. Arthur donated a vintage cash register in exchange for 1 cupcake a week until I perish. Lila kept waiting for the panic to rise again, the feeling she knew so well from her old life, the choking worry that she wasn't enough. But it didn't come. Because this time, she wasn't doing it alone. Evan worked beside her, sanding shelves, drawing up layout plans, testing icing consistencies late into the night. He moved with purpose. With care. Like he wasn't just building a bakery, but a future. Sometimes, they danced to old records while waiting for cakes to cool. Sometimes, they just held hands across the counter. It was quiet. Unhurried. But it was love, Lila knew. Not the kind that blazed, but the kind that rooted. The kind that stayed. They were a week from opening when a letter arrived addressed to Evan. A crisp envelope with a Manhattan postmark. He read it in silence. Folded it slowly. Put it in his pocket. Lila, watching from across the room, felt her stomach knot. That night, he didn't stay for the usual frosting trials. He just kissed her forehead and said, tomorrow, yeah? She nodded. But something about the way he said it sounded like maybe not. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, trying not to worry. Trying not to imagine what it would feel like if he left. Chapter 11, The Sour and the Sweet. The new bakery space had begun to take shape, walls freshly painted in soft cream, shelves installed and lined with mason jars of sprinkles and flour, the scent of vanilla extract forever clinging to the air like a promise. But Lila's heart felt unsteady. It had been 3 days since Evan received the letter. And he hadn't brought it up once. They still worked together efficiently, kindly, but something had shifted in the air between them, like static gathering before a storm. He was quieter. Still warm, but distracted. His smiles didn't quite reach his eyes. Lila tried not to press. Tried not to let her thoughts spiral. But at night, she lay awake tracing worst-case scenarios across her ceiling. That he was going back to New York. That the bakery would open and he'd be gone. That she'd let herself dream too big, too soon. And that it was all about to crumble. Maybe he's just figuring it out, Zoe said gently, one afternoon while they arranged window decals. What if he already has? Lila murmured. You mean what if he's leaving? Lila nodded. Zoe tilted her head. And what if he's not? Lila blinked. What if he's just scared too? Zoe said. What if this us, the cart, the bakery, you is actually something he's afraid to want? Lila swallowed the lump in her throat. That would be worse, somehow. Zoe handed her a frosting spatula like it was a sword. Then you have two options, ask. Or wait. And personally, I think you've waited enough. That evening, after the last coat of paint dried, Lila found Evan in the back kitchen, testing a small batch of cinnamon buttercream. He looked up when she entered. Smiled, faintly. She took a deep breath. Are you leaving? He froze. The spoon in his hand stilled. She forced herself to keep going. The letter. It's been days. And you've been, not you. I need to know if this, she gestured to the room, to herself, to the whole frosting-drenched future they were building, is going to disappear again. Evan exhaled, slowly. It was from a restaurant. In New York. The head chef I used to work with. He's opening a new place and wants me to come on board. Lila's chest ached. And I said no. The word landed with a thud in her ears. What? I said no, he repeated. I didn't even need to think about it. I didn't know how to tell you. Because I realized I didn't want anything to change. I want to stay. Lila's heart stumbled. You want this? I want you, he said simply. She felt the tears rise before she could stop them. You idiot. Excuse me? I've been losing sleep imagining your escape route while you were already here choosing to stay. He smiled, stepping closer. I'm not going anywhere, Lila. She looked up at him. Even if the oven explodes, I'll help rebuild it. Even if we have to sell cupcakes in the rain, I'll hold the umbrella. She laughed through the tears, and he kissed her, gently, like a promise sealed in icing sugar. Opening day dawned misty and cool, with a line of townsfolk already queued along the pavement, craning their necks for a peek at the new sign, the Cupcake Cart Bakery. The windows were strung with warm white lights, and the bell above the door jingled like a happy chime each time someone entered. Lila stood behind the counter in a pale pink apron, hands trembling just slightly as she arranged the very first batch, caramel apple crunch, cinnamon swirl, maple chai, and her newest experiment, a tangy lemon thyme cupcake with whipped cream cheese frosting. Are you ready? Evan asked, sliding beside her with a small box of candied pecans. Absolutely not, she replied. He grinned. Perfect. Let's open the door. Zoe was in charge of social media and balloons. Ginny ran crowd control like a retired general. Arthur brought roses for the proprietress and wore a bow tie just for the occasion. And the town showed up. Old and young. Families, couples, the local librarian with her knitting group. Even a few kids in matching Cupcake Cart t-shirts. Lila barely had time to breathe. Cupcakes flew off the counter. Compliments poured in. The lemon thyme surprise became an instant bestseller. Evan whipped up an emergency batch of frosting between waves. Zoe texted in all caps, "You're trending locally." And sometime after lunch, Lila caught a moment to herself. She leaned against the kitchen doorframe, flour on her cheek, apron smudged, hair escaping her bun. Evan walked past, touched her waist gently in passing, and said, "You're glowing." She didn't argue. That night, after the last crumb had been boxed and the last customer had wandered out with a sleepy smile, Lila turned the lock and leaned against the front door. Exhaustion hit her like a wave. But beneath it, something else, a humming, pulsing joy. They'd done it. She glanced around at the bakery, warm light, frosting-stained counters, empty trays, and the little chalkboard sign that still read opening day, "Be gentle with us." I think they were gentle, she said softly. Evan stepped behind her, sliding his arms around her waist. I think they loved it. Lila closed her eyes. I'm afraid to believe it's real. It's real. And it's ours. He nodded against her hair. All ours. They stood there for a long moment. Then Lila pulled back and smiled. Tomorrow, I want to try a pear and honey cupcake. Sounds terrible. She smirked. "You'll love it." He kissed her nose. "I probably will." Later, in her little apartment above the shop, Lila curled on the couch with a mug of tea and her recipe journal. The pages were smudged and stained and wildly chaotic. But it was hers. She flipped to the back and wrote a new note. Chapter 11, We opened the door. And beneath it, in smaller print, "It feels like coming home." Chapter 12, The Quiet Season. Autumn arrived in Willow Bay with its usual grace, quiet mornings soaked in gold, the sea turning a deeper blue, and the scent of wood smoke curling from cottage chimneys. The crowds thinned, sandals were traded for boots, and the market hours shortened along with the days. Lila had never liked fall much before. In the city, it had always felt like the waiting room to winter. But here, in this town that moved at the speed of kindness, fall was something softer. It meant baked apples and wool scarves, butternut soup simmering in Aunt Ginny's kitchen, and long walks down leaf-scattered lanes with a coffee cup clutched in gloved hands. It also meant change. Evan had taken the job in New York. He left 2 weeks after the bake-off. No big declarations. No weepy airport scene. Just a long hug outside her apartment and a quiet, "You made me remember I could still love something." He'd kissed her like a goodbye and like a promise all at once. And then he was gone. Lila didn't wallow. Not really. She had too much to do. The cupcake cart had taken on a life of its own after the bake-off win. Orders flooded in. People stopped her on the street. A local tourism blog featured her. She started waking up before her alarm. Zoe became her right-hand everything. Aunt Ginny, her emotional support baker. Even Mr. Beecham from the hardware store started coming by once a week to offer unsolicited advice about durable frosting stabilizers, whatever that meant. Lila worked, and baked, and smiled and missed Evan with a quiet, achy sort of fondness. Not the hollow kind of missing she used to know, the kind that gnawed at your ribs and whispered you were unlovable. No. This was different. She missed him and still felt whole. Some nights, she reread his note. Other nights, she made cardamom sugar and pretended he was standing beside her, teasing her about overmixing. One afternoon in late October, the cupcake cart broke down. Literally. The axle cracked during setup at the Harvest Festival, sending frosting bags flying and Lila nearly into a bale of decorative hay. She stared at the lopsided cart, mortified. "This is it," she said to Zoe. "This is how it ends. Death by pumpkin display." But instead of laughter or panic, Zoe just handed her a caramel apple and said, "Maybe it's time." "Time for what?" Zoe pointed across the street. To the small, sunlit shop front next to the town library. The one that had been for rent since forever. The one with the crooked shutters and the perfect corner window. Time to build something that doesn't roll away. The idea terrified Lila. And thrilled her. She met with the landlord. She crunched numbers with Ginny. She panicked about ovens and permits and her total lack of business savvy. But she also sketched layouts on napkins, daydreamed about display cases, and bought a ridiculously cute enamel open sign. She signed the lease a week later. And just like that, the cupcake cart was becoming the cupcake corner. By mid-November, the little shop was coming together. Lila painted the walls herself, soft cream and the lightest blush pink. Ginny donated antique shelving. Zoe negotiated a wildly discounted espresso machine from a friend in Portland. Even the mayor popped by to donate a stack of vintage recipe books for decor. Still, something felt unfinished. It was the space beside the window. She kept imagining a little spice shelf there. A row of exotic jars. A handwritten note about flavor pairings. She could almost hear Evan explaining the difference between Saigon cinnamon and Ceylon. But the shelf stayed empty. Thanksgiving came. Then December. The holiday market brought crowds back to Willow Bay. The cupcake corner soft opened with a peppermint bark cupcake that nearly caused a stampede. Lila found herself laughing more. Singing while she baked. Hosting spontaneous recipe demos. Living. Every now and then, she'd check her phone. Still no word. She refused to be bitter. People leave. People come back. Or they don't. But one night, close to Christmas, something changed. It started with a package. Small. Brown paper. No return address. Inside, one perfectly frosted cupcake cherry blossom with cardamom and a single train ticket. Willow Bay, New York City. January 3rd. One way. No note. Just that. Lila sat on the shop floor for a long time, holding the box like it was a baby bird. She didn't cry. She smiled. Then she took a bite of the cupcake. It was perfect. The next day, she built the spice shelf. She filled it with tiny jars. Cinnamon. Sumac. Vanilla pods. A tiny framed recipe. And one empty space. Waiting. Chapter 13. Home is where the oven is. The early winter wind carried the scent of cinnamon and wood smoke down Cherry Street, rustling the edges of scarves and sweeping old leaves into soft spirals. The town had exchanged its fall garlands for twinkling lights, and the street lamps wore woolen cozies knitted by the Willow Bay yarn circle. Lila stood just outside the new bakery's door, fumbling with a stubborn key that didn't yet recognize her touch. The shop sign above her head was still covered with a white cloth, hiding the name she and Evan had finally chosen. She took a breath. Then pushed open the door. The inside smelled faintly of plaster, fresh wood, and hope. The front counter was curved oak, salvaged from the old library desk Evan had discovered at a yard sale. The pastry case gleamed, waiting for sugar-dusted stories to be tucked behind its glass. Shelves were lined with spice jars and tea tins, and above them hung hand-painted signs naming each blend: Wistful Earl, Ginger Gold Memory, Second Chance Chai. The oven was new, industrial, efficient. But Lila had already baked in it 3 times, and each time had felt like lighting a fire in the hearth of something larger than herself. Zoe arrived first, her arms full of ribbon-tied boxes and one rogue paper snowflake stuck to her hair. She dropped the boxes on the counter and grinned. Grand opening vibes achieved. Where's the grump? Late, Lila said, smiling. As if summoned, Evan appeared at the door a moment later, balancing a tray of still-warm morning buns and a thermos of coffee. He was wearing his navy sweater and the apron Lila had stitched with tiny embroidered cupcakes and stars. Nice of you to join us, Zoe teased. I bring pastry tribute, he replied, and handed her one. That usually buys me 5 minutes of silence. Lila watched them with quiet joy. In the strange, sweet way life worked, they had all found their places again. Not without cracks or flower-flecked chaos, but together. By mid-morning, the shop was full. The townspeople came in waves, curious, kind, and wrapped in scarves. Aunt Ginny arrived in a cape and feathered hat, declaring the raspberry scones life-affirming. Mr. Tiller from the hardware store brought a single daffodil in a mason jar. The mayor stopped by and requested a standing order for Thursday morning cinnamon rolls. Children pressed their noses to the pastry case. Teenagers lingered near the reading nook Lila had insisted on installing in the corner, with its mismatched chairs and cookie-shaped cushions. Evan handled the baking. Lila handled the people. Zoe handled absolutely everything else with a clipboard and peppermint bark. At noon, Lila pulled the cloth from the sign above the door. Whisk and wonder. The crowd clapped. Evan blushed. Lila cried. Zoe handed her a tissue shaped like a snowman. Later that afternoon, when the rush had settled into the soft hum of background chatter, Evan found her standing behind the counter, hands wrapped around a mug of lavender milk tea. You did it, he said. She shook her head. We did it. He reached across the counter and took her free hand. You sure you're not going to run off and become a kombucha heiress or something? She smiled. Not unless it comes with a cupcake clause. He leaned closer. I was thinking. Dangerous, she teased. He ignored her. What if we hosted a Sunday supper? Once a month. Something cozy. Comfort food. People could bring a dish or just bring themselves. Her smile softened. That sounds exactly like what this place should be. The first Sunday supper was chaotic and perfect. They cleared the tables, lit candles in old teacups, and watched as neighbors arrived with everything from lasagna to mulled cider to a questionable jello mold that mysteriously disappeared halfway through the evening. There was music. A little dancing. Laughter that echoed off the windows and curled into the corners like steam. Evan stood by the kitchen door, arms crossed, watching it all with a quiet pride. Lila slipped beside him and rested her head on his shoulder. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" she asked. "That we should probably hide the good knives before the next one?" She laughed. "No. I mean, this is what home feels like, right?" He looked down at her. "Yeah. It really is." Spring came early to Willow Bay. Tulips nudged their way through the frost, and the cherry trees along the street began to bloom just in time for the bakery's 3-month anniversary. They celebrated with a new cupcake flavor, cherry blossom and lemon, topped with white chocolate butterflies. They sold out by noon. Business was steady. Some days were hard. Ovens broke. Deliveries were late. The frosting curdled once in front of an entire visiting bus tour. But the rhythm of it, the early mornings, the flour on the floor, the warmth of something rising, felt right. One evening, Lila found Evan sitting in the back nook of the shop with a sketchpad. She peered over his shoulder. "What's that?" He turned the page to show her. It was a rough blueprint. A second location. Her breath caught. "Not now," he said quickly. "Maybe someday. But it's nice to dream, isn't it?" She leaned down and kissed his cheek. "Let's build this one first. Brick by brick. Cupcake by cupcake." He nodded. "Together. Always." On a soft, golden evening at the edge of summer, they closed the shop early. The streets were quiet. A warm breeze stirred the last petals from the cherry trees. Evan locked the door. Lila slipped her arm through his. They walked slowly down Cherry Street, past the spots that had become threads in their shared tapestry, the park bench where she first spilled flour all over herself, the antique shop where she found the cart, the stall where he had once sold spices with haunted eyes and a hidden heart. At the end of the street, they stopped. The cupcake cart was still there, tucked into the courtyard behind the shop. Now it was painted bright robin's egg blue, with a tiny awning and a new chalkboard sign. They stood there a moment, letting it all settle. "It started here," Lila said. Evan took her hand. "It starts again every day." She looked up at him. "So what now?" He kissed her gently. "Now we bake." And together, beneath a sky full of quiet stars and powdered sugar dreams, they did.
Thanks for listening. Stay cozy, and I'll see you in the next story.